Hey everyone, welcome to part 3 of Reconstruction. Our question to think about here: how, when, and why did Reconstruction end? One of the things that we're going to see happening is that Southerners are going to be continually resisting the Republican control of their states. And at the same time, Northerners are going to grow tired of trying to force the Southern states to correct their behavior. Also, we're going to see other issues starting to take precedent as we move into the early 1870s. And so we're going to see the eventual end of Reconstruction. So the collapse or the waning of Republican control in the Southern states is going to lead to a power shift in the South as people who called themselves redeemers begin to take control of the state governments and then proceed to roll back the radical Republican control. So the redeemers are white conservatives in the South who begin to regain political power. With the rise of the redeemers, we're going to see a negative impact on African Americans. The 15th Amendment had given Black men the right to vote, but it still left some things up to the Southern states in terms of guidelines for who is eligible to vote within that population. So the Southern states are going to work on disenfranchising Southern African Americans. So the word franchise is the root word there, and it means the same thing as suffrage, the right to vote. So disenfranchisement means losing the right to vote. And so Southern states began requiring poll taxes, which was a tax you had to pay in order to vote. They also implemented literacy tests, which you had to be able to prove that you could read and write in order to vote. Now, keep in mind that it had been illegal to teach slaves to read and write for many, many years. So, unsurprisingly, many African Americans in the South could not read or write. The other thing was understanding clauses, that you had to explain a portion of the state constitution or the federal constitution in order to be eligible to vote. And keep in mind with both the literacy tests and the understanding clauses that it is always going to be white Southerners who are implementing these tests. So no matter what the person answers, they're going to be wrong. In order to make sure that the white population is still able to vote, many states implemented grandfather clauses, which meant that if your grandfather was eligible to vote in 1860, then you could bypass some of these obstacles. In addition, the Southerners are trying to make up for the fact that the Black codes have been struck down by the 14th Amendment. So in order to maintain a sense of dominance within Southern society, Southern states are going to implement segregation laws. These require the races to be separate. They're also called Jim Crow laws. And so you would see separate schools, separate cemeteries, and any sort of public building could be segregated. These laws are going to be challenged by a guy named Homer Plessy coming out of Louisiana. And this case makes its way very slowly to the U.S. Supreme Court. And in 1896, the Supreme Court rules against Homer Plessy by arguing that having separate facilities for Blacks and whites does not violate the 14th Amendment's equal protection of the laws as long as these facilities are equal. And of course, what's going to happen is this is going to create separate facilities that will never be equal. The final negative impact for African Americans was the most disturbing, and it was the dramatic increase in the number of lynchings in the South. So a person would be accused of committing a crime, and rather than having that person arrested and put on trial, a mob would simply execute this individual. And really, the authorities did nothing about this. And so the rise of lynching stems from the disenfranchisement of white Southerners and the rise of hate groups like the Ku Klux Klan. But a couple of years ago, a professor from Lee College down by Houston presented another element to the story of lynching. And what she said was that after slavery was abolished, Black bodies no longer had value to white Southerners. And what that meant is that during the antebellum period when slavery was legal, there was really no law that prevented a slaveholder from beating his slave to death. But he probably wouldn't do that on purpose simply because that body, that human being, was property that had value, monetary value. And once the institution of slavery is abolished, then from the perspective of white Southerners, that body no longer had value and could be eliminated. And so this between 1882 and 1903, we saw nearly 2,000 Black Southerners executed by mobs in that time period. And then during the 1890s, lynchings occurred at a rate of 150 per year. Coming into the presidential election of 1876, both Southerners and Northerners had really grown tired of Reconstruction. And we also see the Redeemers really gaining ground in the Southern states, and other issues really starting to become more important to both Northerners and Southerners. And so what we're going to see here in 1876 is that this election is going to bring the era of Reconstruction to a close. Rutherford B. Hayes was the Republican candidate in this election. Samuel Tilden of New York is the Democratic candidate. And what we see in this election is that Samuel Tilden won the popular vote. But the problem is that the Electoral College was too close to call. Part of the problem was that 3 Southern states sent in disputed electoral returns, which means that both Democrats and Southerners are claiming victory in these 3 Southern states. And when you take a look at the Electoral College map here, you can very clearly see the 3 states: Louisiana, Florida, and South Carolina. Both Democrats and Republicans are claiming victory there. The problem here is that normally, if we just had a tie, the Constitution tells us how to solve that. We send it over to the House of Representatives and they vote and solve the tie in the Electoral College. But technically, we don't have a tie. If one of the 2 candidates gains most of these Electoral College votes from the disputed states, we would have a clear winner in this election. But we don't know how to solve the dispute within the Electoral College because there's nothing in the Constitution that prepares us for this. So instead, the Congress is going to create a commission of 15 men, 7 Republicans, 7 Democrats, and 1 independent to settle the issue of who gets these Electoral College votes. But at the last minute, the independent drops out to run for the Senate, and Congress replaces him with another Republican. So now we have 8 Republicans and 7 Democrats trying to decide who gets these Electoral College votes. It's not shocking when we see that in a vote of 8-7, they choose to give those Electoral College votes to the Republican Rutherford Hayes. Democrats are furious. Take a look at this political cartoon here. You can see on the paper it says Tilden or blood. There were some Southern Democrats that argued we needed to restart the Civil War in order to determine the outcome of this election. But of course, we have this hand trying to stop this action. And the way this was concluded is that a group of unnamed Republicans met with a group of unnamed Democrats. I like to picture a smoke-filled room, men smoking cigars, drinking brandy, and they're deciding the outcome of this election. And what they decided is Southern Democrats would allow Hayes to be the president as long as Reconstruction ended immediately. And that means any remaining federal troops stationed in the South would be removed. An agreement was reached. Historians call this the Compromise of 1877. So Rutherford Hayes, the Republican, becomes the president and Reconstruction ended immediately. But of course, we have a lot of questions that remain unanswered. What's going to happen to African Americans in the South now that Republicans are not there to protect them? I mean, what are these other issues that have taken precedent over Reconstruction? I mean, is the divide between the North and the South really over? Well, we don't have time to answer those questions, so that's why we have History 1302. Stay tuned. So our question to think about: how, when, and why did Reconstruction end? It ends because the Redeemers have taken over control of the South. Northerners have lost interest in trying to force the South to behave. It ends abruptly in 1877 when Republicans and Democrats agree to the Compromise of 1877, which gives the presidency to Hayes and ends Reconstruction forever.